Corps of Chaplains is the Association of Military Chaplains that serves our armed forces by providing spiritual and religious services to soldiers and their families. Since July of 1775, about 25,000 chaplains have served about 25 million service members. They've been placed in combat units. They have provided chaplain services in our military hospitals. They have ministered to students in military academies and schools. Over 300 of them have been killed in battle over the years. Right now there are about 3,000 chaplains serving our various units. They come from about 140 different religious groups, including Protestants and Catholics and Jewish, Muslim, even Wiccan chaplains. Their purpose is to provide for the spiritual needs of the military without favoring one group over the other. But what do you do for people who don't believe in God? Do they need a chaplain? You would think that an atheist has no need of religious services. How would you talk religion and spirituality with people who are adamant that they have none or need none? That would be like me trying to be the pastor of somebody who insists that there is no God. What would even be the point of connection? Interestingly enough, atheist groups have repeatedly requested the chaplain corps to appoint atheist chaplains. One group called the MAAF, the Military Association and Freethinkers, announced last week that they would be requesting Congress to approve atheist chaplains for the military. For its part, the Defense Department says that it provides all possible practices of religion among military personnel. What would atheist religious practices be? Isn't that an oxymoron? Now, I'm not trying to be critical of the MAAF, but I want you to think about the way that things have changed in terms of society's view of religion and faith. There used to be a day when the idea that Christianity would be just one of any numbers of choices you could make in terms of religion. That idea sounded crazy. Stores were even closed on Sunday so that people wouldn't be tempted to break God's laws by working on the Sabbath. The vast majority of the people considered the Sabbath to be Sunday, so church was the only game in town on a Sunday. And that's just one of thousands of examples of the way that our faith used to dominate the way that people looked at life. Back then, people couldn't imagine a day when Christianity would have to compete with other religions for market share, the way that one clothes store at the mall competes with another. If Christianity is the one true faith, then why would it even have to compete with others? Wouldn't God want to make it win? Wouldn't God tilt the table in our direction? If Christianity loses influence, is that a failure on our part? Does the fact that the military is considering atheist chaplains mean that we have failed God in some way? People have been asking themselves those kinds of questions ever since Jesus' followers started telling people about Jesus coming back from the dead. The passage we looked at this morning challenges us to think about how we practice our faith in a world where we no longer have the kind of home court advantage that we used to have in society. How do you guide your children to think about their faith when many people around them choose their religion in the same way that they choose their fast food or their music? Can we explain to them why they would want to be Baptist instead of being something else? Jesus' early followers faced a similar situation as they left their homeland to tell people in other parts of the world about Jesus. There were thousands of other religions floating around back then, most of which were pretty hostile to any new kid on the block. One of Jesus' followers was Paul, although Jesus and Paul really never met during Jesus' ministry. After Jesus' death, when Jesus' followers began telling people about his message, Paul had a number of Jesus' followers arrested. He thought that they were leading people astray from the true teachings. But he later had some kind of encounter with Jesus after his resurrection, and he becomes Jesus' biggest advocate. Paul went all around the Roman Empire telling people about Jesus, trying to convince them that Jesus was God's son, that his death saved the world, and that people had just missed it all. Paul started churches in a number of towns. But one town that offered him a great challenge was the city of Athens. Paul had traveled there on one of his missionary trips. While he was waiting for some of his companions to arrive and help him, he started walking around the city of Athens, trying to get the lay of the land. Athens was such a challenge for him, not because some entrenched religious group would be openly hostile, but because there were so many other gods that people worshipped there. Imagine if there was a shopping mall where people went to shop for religion. You could go to one store and you'd find some people who tell you about a certain god. They sometimes would sell you a statue or something that's related to that god. And you could go next door and find out about some other kind of god. That's kind of what it was like, not exactly, but kind of. They weren't competing in the way that stores compete today. All of these gods were considered part of the larger story of Greek religion. Around Athens, the people had constructed statues honoring all of these different gods who were part of these different religions. There were dozens of them. And just so that they didn't anger the gods that they left out, they even made a statue with a plaque that said, "To an unknown God." And I know, that sounds a little silly. Why bother going to the effort of building a statue to a god if you don't even know whether or not that god exists? It was the religious version of covering their bases. In their minds, if they accidentally left a god out, just because they didn't know about that god, they were liable to be punished by that god. The fact that they didn't know of whatever unknown god might be flying around out there was no excuse. Now, Paul walked around and he looked at all of these statues and he saw that one and he thought it was all kind of silly. As a Jew and a follower of Jesus, he believed that God was one. The idea that there were all of these gods out there interacting with one another the way that you and I interact with other people, that was crazy in Paul's mind. None of them must have been all that great and powerful if there were so many of them. Paul believed that there was one God who exercised authority over all human beings, animal and spiritual. That God didn't share power with anybody else. That God created the universe, those dozens of gods who were being memorialized in Athens, seemed weak by comparison with Paul's God. Another thing that drove Paul crazy was the idea that they went to the effort of constructing a statue that was supposed to look like one of these gods. Now, if you read the Ten Commandments, it says that the Jews are forbidden from making anything, any sculpture, painting, or otherwise, that's in the image of a god. The idea that somebody would make a sculpture of God was silly to Paul also. I mean, so you're going to make a sculpture of God. What is that even going to look like? Is it going to look like a human being? Is that what God looks like? Doubtful. To Paul, all these statues were a bunch of idols. He really found them offensive. But he also found them to be a starting point when it came to conversations about Jesus. Paul went to this marketplace in Athens almost daily, and he met with the people in town who wanted to talk about philosophy. I know that doesn't sound very exciting, but think about it this way. Hundreds of years earlier, Athens had been the place where people like Plato and Aristotle had their schools. It was known as this place where learned, educated people stood around all day and debated the meaning of life. They did nothing but debate ways to understand the relationship between the gods and humanity. By Jesus' time, Athens wasn't quite as important as other cities like Corinth. But the people of the town were constantly interested in hearing about the latest philosophy or religious idea. After enough encounters with the people in town, Paul was finally invited to speak at this place called the Areopagus. It was this giant stone hill where the great philosophers in Athens met to discuss religion and faith. And I actually have a couple of pictures for you. Let me show you. The way you get to the Areopagus is you walk up this set of stairs. I don't think that's quite ADA compliant, so be careful on your way up. And then here's the next one. And that's what it looks like from a distance. The stairs lead up to that rock, and you sit on top of this giant rock, and you've got the panorama of Athens, which is beautiful, by the way, surrounding you, and you get to sit there and talk about the gods and what you believe. And there's even a plaque. This is a plaque with some of the text from what we read this morning in the book of Acts. It's Greek to you because it's in Greek, but it's words from Acts commemorating Paul's speech here at the Areopagus. Imagine any of us would be a little intimidated at the idea of getting in front of all of these highly educated people and speaking to them about something that they knew about. No matter how well you know your material, there's always somebody else who knows a lot too. You want to come across as a knowledgeable person if you ever hope to have a chance to convince people that what you're going to say has any merit. I remember when I was in junior high school, I took a speech/drama class. And one of my assignments was to make a speech to the class, and I don't even remember what I was talking about that day. But I put my speech together and I brought it up to the lectern. And I was noticing as the people in the class were starting to chuckle, and they were looking at me, looking at my pants, and I'm wondering what's going on. Well, maybe you all are old enough to remember the days when there was a store in town called Zayre. They have Zayres in Peoria. Zayre was like Kmart, only a couple of steps down in quality. And so my folks got me my blue jeans at Zayre, which were very cheap. But what happened with those jeans is that the zipper would come down throughout the day. And so I got up to speak in front of my classmates, and my zipper is down. And I about turned purple, being embarrassed as I began that speech of mine. You always worry about this. You never know what's going to happen when you get in front of people and start speaking. Paul addressed the people there with a level of confidence that he always seems to have. If you read his letters, he always seems to be very sure that he's right about everything. He said to them, hey, I was walking around town here and I saw all of these statues that you have in town. I even noticed this one to an unknown God. You all are so fortunate because I am in town today to tell you who that unknown God is. And he went on to say a lot of the things that I just mentioned, how God made the universe, how God doesn't need to be commemorated with a statue in town. Paul told them that God made people in a way that always caused them to wonder about the God who created them. Paul also did something else, and I think this is key because it caught their attention. He saw a common thread between their way of thinking about God and his way. Like him, they considered themselves not just to be God's creation, but as children of God. He made that connection not only by quoting the Old Testament, there are verses in the Old Testament talk about us as God's children. And by the way, these Greek folks didn't know that Old Testament passage. So he also quotes one of their poets, a poet who writes this phrase that Paul quotes, for we too are his offspring. It was Paul's way of saying, in some ways, we aren't totally different. Paul mentioned his belief that people can have eternal life through Jesus, that his death and resurrection made it possible for us to be resurrected from the dead someday. Now that idea seemed ridiculous to many people in Paul's audience. They believed that when you die, your spirit leaves your body at the time of death. So when Paul talked about dead bodies being brought back to life by the power of God, these people kind of rolled their eyes at him. Paul said he was sure about resurrection because he himself came into contact with the resurrected Jesus. Now, Paul's results were mixed in terms of convincing those learned people to believe what he was teaching. Some people in the audience patronized him after his speech by saying, we'll have you come and talk with us some other time. They didn't really mean it. They were just being nice. But there were a few folks who Paul won over with his speech. The author names some of them to show us that he wasn't just making this up. But the part of the story that I want to focus on today is that we are very much back in a time where our faith does not start from a place of wide acceptance. That's the situation Paul was in. People are skeptical. They're Athenians these days. Churches used to have the authority in people's minds that if people didn't listen to us, they would answer to God for not listening. We don't have that authority in people's minds anymore. Not most people anyway. In fact, we are one of many religious groups that people could choose from. Even if we bring our teenage kids to church every week, they still know that. And the church has had a hard time in recent years explaining to people why faith in Jesus is more advantageous than faith in some other God or some other religion. The good news is that we can learn a lot from Paul because he was in a similar situation. Here are a couple of things that I think we can take away from his resurrection, from his interaction with the people of Athens. First, I think Paul makes a lot of effort to do things in a way that is relevant to the people he's speaking to. He researches the community. He gets the religious landscape. He understands the language that they use. He also sees the dynamics of the city of Athens. He knows where to be. He knows who he should really be talking to. He knows enough about their literature that he can draw parallels between what they're reading and what he's saying. In contrast, aside from the last 50 years, the church has really dominated the way that people think. It dominated the music that they listen to, the political landscape that we're in. We came from the perspective that people had to adapt to our music, our way of speaking, our way of presenting information, organizing ourselves. We talked about what we thought was important. We were the church. We didn't have to ask ourselves what kind of music people outside the church wanted to hear. We considered the music outside the church as irrelevant and in most cases profane even. Except classical music, we've almost always been okay with that. We didn't have to adapt our preaching to what people outside the church felt was important to them. It was our job as God's messengers to tell them what was important. We didn't have to present information to them in a modern way. It didn't matter if it was more convenient for them. It was our initiative. We read hymns out of hymnals. We read out of our pew Bibles. We communicated by a paper letter sent by mail to people's houses. Some of you can even remember when getting a telephone in the church building was a real modern innovation. It was almost too worldly to use newer phrases that younger people began to use. Any preacher in the 1960s who used the word groovy in a sermon was in danger of losing his job. It was our right as the church to set the standards for language, both inside and outside the church. I'm going to say this as kindly as I can. That was all nice back then, but today it is all out the window. We can lament those days. We can try really hard to get those days back, but they are gone. All that authority that we used to have to commend our faith to other people is gone. It is earned presently as we interact with the community. In order to reach the Athenians of today, in order to communicate that same message of Jesus today that Paul communicated back then, we have to do things in a way that is relevant to people who have seldom or never darkened our church door. We are using new technology because people can't hear us unless we use it. We've recently started video recording our worship services and uploading them to the internet so that people who want to find out about our church can do that while they are sitting in their pajamas in their living room at their house, surfing the internet. And I might add that we are latecomers in that process. Churches have been doing that for years, getting their message out in ways that other than through printed paper pamphlets with the time of the church services. Music is another example. Mark and I are in 100% agreement that we need to incorporate more contemporary music here at the church for the very same reason that Paul quoted that Greek poet in his sermon in Acts 17. People need to hear the message of Jesus in a way that is relevant and meaningful to them. When we were preparing for Youth Sunday, we asked the youth, what do you all want to sing for Youth Sunday? You know, you get to pick for one Sunday. What do you want to sing? Well, they picked 2 songs that they had all been listening to on the radio and seen on YouTube. Our youth saw connections between some of the things that we talk about here on Sunday, the lyrics of those songs. They were very excited about being able to share those songs with the congregation. It's been a really long time since they were that excited about singing any song in church. We're simply trying to do the same thing that Paul did in Athens that day. We need to communicate Jesus' message in a way that people are receptive to. We didn't used to have to care about that so much, but now we do. More than ever in our lives and in the life of this congregation. The slower a church is to realize their need to be relevant, the faster it will be to close its doors. As we try to be relevant, the more effective we will be in trying to do what we've always been trying to do in the first place. Letting people know what Jesus has done for us, giving them an opportunity to let Him change their lives too. This challenge faces us in a way that it did not face our parents' generation. And that is not to diminish the challenges they faced, which were many. But we as a church must rise to this challenge. We must make Jesus' message heard in a marketplace of religious ideas. Believe me, those Athenians out there really are looking for something, and we have something great to share with them. Let us pray. Oh God, we ask that you would help us to be relevant in the way that we communicate your message to people. Help us to make connections, and help us to care, and help us to be willing to make the changes we need in order to share that message with the people around us. It's in Jesus' name that